This is Verdorin, I'm Pierre de Lancer. Questions like what does this mean are central to our encounters with art. How are these signs connected? Or how do all symbols fit into an unstated scheme are the fundamental concerns of aesthetics. Yet, when the same concerns crop up regularly in almost any other part of life, we give them a clinical, pathological name: paranoia. These questions indeed were the makings of a Paranoia, a symposium held at Verdorin in February 2025. Paranoia is an attempt to drag the dark, suspicious impulses that animate all artistic interpretation into the open via the time-honored medium of the symposium. This episode is a recording of Reading Between the Lines, a talk by Thomas Peermohamed Lambert. Thomas is a writer and scholar. He co-organized the Paranoia event with me. In his presentation, Thomas discusses the strange affinity between literary modernism and conspiracy theory. He makes example of the paranoia evident in the work of writers like Kafka and Borges. Thomas also considers the death of the inductive novel and the question of whether readers have become rather too trusting of what they read. You'll find links to further information about the symposium, Thomas's research, and his forthcoming novel, as well as other programs at Verdorin in the show notes.
All right. Afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah? Good. Excellent. And does anyone not have or cannot see a handout? In time-honoured academic style, I'm giving you sort of homework to do. And so as to give an illusion of a kind of dialogic thing, what I might do is occasionally, if we come to a chunk of text, a gobbet that I think is relevant, I might ask someone or pick on someone to read it out for me. So if anyone's feeling brave, please help me out on that front. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about today really is paranoia, and specifically literary paranoia, and paranoia's strange affinity that it has for modernism and the modernist period. But I thought I'd start looking at this in a slightly roundabout way. I mean, we're going to use this word paranoia a lot today, but actually, it struck me when I was looking into the kind of clinical history of paranoia that there's a very strange dynamic. The history of paranoia as a clinical phenomenon in modernity is really a story of increasing abstraction. So we sort of move away throughout the sort of modernist period, at least, from the idea that paranoia is caused just by the wet stuff in the brain, and towards an idea that paranoia is really a kind of metaphysical attunement or sensibility. Paranoia is us channeling something in the world rather than something just in our brains. So the early theorists, people like Emil Kraepelin, who was a German, I think a coiner at least of the word paranoiac as a clinical designation, he thought that it was basically a problem with your myelin sheaths in your nerves. It was all physiological. By the time we get to Freud, I think that's probably the most influential theory of paranoia that we might encounter in our literary studies of paranoia. By the time we get to Freud, it is a question of interpretation, but it's in a very sort of, it's still within the frame of bourgeois sexuality. So for Freud, paranoia is pretty much everywhere and always the result of kind of repressed homosexual desire. And we see this in his case notes to Dr. Schreber. Dr. Schreber is a homosexual, but he can't assimilate this phrase, if you like, that I, a man, love you, another man. And as a result, the whole world must be out of kilter, and a range of delusions start ensuing. Things must not be as they seem. So he thinks, oh, I can't love him, he hates me, therefore I'm being persecuted by him, and actually I'm being persecuted by everyone. And the mind sort of runs away with itself, according to this sort of dream logic in Freud. Now, interestingly, by the time we get to sort of Freud's mid-century and late 20th century critics, by the time we get to people like Deleuze and Guattari, paranoia isn't about the brain or the mind at all. It's about something more like signification itself. Could someone with a handout, perhaps Nina, would you mind reading this quote from Deleuze and Guattari, or at least some of it?
Sure.
Thank you.
Every sign refers to another sign, and only to another sign ad infinitum. The world begins to signify before anyone knows what it signifies. The signifier is given without being known. Your wife looked at you with a funny expression, and this morning the mailman handed you a letter from the IRS and crossed his fingers. Then you stepped into a pile of dog shit. You saw two sticks positioned on the sidewalk, like the hands of a watch. They were whispering behind your back when you arrived at the office. It doesn't matter what it means, it's still signifying. The sign that refers to other signs is struck with a strange impotence and uncertainty, but mighty is the signifier that constitutes this chain.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We've had our own illustration of this here. So what I take this to mean anyway is that paranoia is something like a kind of hyper alertness to the capacity of the world for what we might call reference. And the paranoiac submits himself or herself to really the imperatives of reference, just goes all the way following the chains of signification wherever they might lead, and attempts so hard to make the world mean something unified and coherent that he or she is, to all intents and purposes and to all outside observers, mad. Now, in this talk, I don't so much want to adjudicate between these different conceptions of paranoia. I kind of think actually where you land it depends more on your sort of a priori philosophical commitments that you bring to the table. But what I do want to do is notice that this trajectory that paranoia takes as a clinical designation bears a kind of strange resemblance to the trajectory the paranoiac goes on in its own right. You know, a personal malady is elevated. It becomes an entire metaphysical predicament. You're not sick because of a chemical imbalance in your brain. You're sick because of the condition of the entire world. So my first claim really then is this, and this is why I think modernism in particular is really important. There is something about the 20th century in particular that tends to see psychic problems, if you like, as local instantiations of grand overarching metaphysical problems or quandaries. And this in some sense is a paranoiac impulse. The paranoiac impulse, or the paranoiac's creed, if you like, is that everything is connected in one big unitary field of meaning, and that any surplus to that, any remainder that we encounter, needs to be sort of frantically stamped out by a process of manic interpretation. So IRS man, dog shit, you know, mind world, it all needs to cohere. So with that little bit of phenomenology out of the way, it might not have escaped your notice that this is also kind of exactly what we're doing, I think at least some of the time, when we look at art. This is exactly what we're doing when we look at art or encounter writing. We try and make it all make sense as a single. We're trying to make art look like one. We're trying to understand or comprehend art as one unitary thing whose capacity for reference has been utterly tamed. And I think many writers still, in their heart of hearts, cleave to the pronouncement of Joseph Conrad, for example, who in one of his prefaces, I think it's the preface to The Secret Agent from memory, says that work that aspires, however humbly, to the condition of art should carry its justification in every line. And I think it's very, very telling that works of art, you know, even these sort of high modernist works of art that tend to get described as fragmentary or dissonant in some way or formless, they're actually usually prized for the fact that they elevate all of these formal features into a kind of governing principle. You know, you wouldn't like The Wasteland, I contend, quite as much if actually 85-90% of it just read like Browning and then it just went off the rails at the end. It would actually be a really very different poem. Now, where does this all come from, and why am I associating this with modernity? The great historians of paranoia and modernism, and there are a couple, funnily enough, Daniel Trotter and the great Louis Sass, whose book Madness and Modernism I really recommend, blame the sensibility essentially, and didn't want this to become a theme, but there you go, on the Germans. The idea that everything in a work of art or literature should sort of check out in a unified scheme comes in the first place, they say, from the great systems builders of 19th century German philosophy, your Hegel's, your Marx's, although we could disagree with this. And then in the second place, from the various artists and musicians who interpreted these great systems builders. I think particularly influential here would be someone like Wagner, whose idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, a sort of total work of art where everything is integrated, everything is unified, really reigned supreme certainly among people like Eliot and Pound, these sort of high modernists from the Anglo-Saxon world. I've pasted into a handout a couple of fragments from T.S. Eliot. They're conveniently, just to keep everyone on their toes, not in the right place. They're number 3. I don't suppose any takers to read out these couple of fragments from Eliot. Otherwise, I'll pick on someone. Yes, sure. Excellent, fantastic. Go for it, Eliot.
Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead, up the white road, there's always another one walking beside you.
That's great. And if you look beneath it, there's also an extract from Eliot's notes to The Wasteland. Could you just give them a read as well?
The following lines were stimulated by an account of one of the Antarctic expeditions. I forget which, but I think one of Shackleton's. It was related that the party of explorers, at the extremity of their strength, had the constant delusion there was one more member than could actually be counted.
Thank you very much. Well read. Now, what strikes me, I don't know what you think. You might disagree with me, but what strikes me when I read through Eliot's notes to The Wasteland is how astonishingly inadequate they actually are, and how consistently misleading and beside the point a lot of the illusions he induces us to chase up are. We look at this quotation, and who is the third who walks beside you? I mean, there is Christopher Ricks in the annotated Eliot and the annotated Wasteland chases up about at least 10 possible meanings for this, all of which seem to me more sort of systematically useful than Shackleton. The next note in this to a few lines later, Eliot's talking about this bird a thrush that he encounters, and talking about its geographical distribution and how he used to listen to it singing. And never once does he mention that this is the same bird that Philomel in the Greek myth turns into, despite the fact that this tragic Greek princess has been haunting the poem. So what I think what I put to you is that Eliot, in some sense, is teasing a kind of illusion chasing here. He's deliberately giving us something which is woefully inadequate to work out any unified schematic meaning to the poem. And he's trying to get us essentially to become exasperated and paranoiac, arrive at the conviction that there must be more here than meets the eye. So in a sense, what I'm really arguing, I guess, is that the enormous frame of reference in high modernism, in poems like this or Pound's cantos, is designed not so much to represent the fragmentation of the age in itself, so much as an attempt to induce a mimetic paranoia in the reader. Excuse me, sorry. In a sense, what you might say is that the teenagers who encounter this poem in class for the first time and treat it as one big crossword clue, much to the annoyance of their teachers, are actually right in some sense. There is a strong crossword clue energy to a lot of high modernist writing, and I don't think we should entirely ignore it. What I think this also shows, and this is a more general point, is the way in which modernist paranoia is pursued in some sense ironically. Eliot seems to be summoning the same impulse that Deleuze talks about to hammer down meanings once and for all, but he's also doing this, I think, safe in the knowledge that this won't be fully possible. Irony and paranoia, in other words, are in some sense mutually constitutive in modernism. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind if we start invoking paranoia as artists or people interested in art. You embark, if you like, on this metaphysical or hermeneutic attempt to schematize everything, make it all check out, because you have some intimation that actually something about the world will resist you in that endeavor. That's certainly how I feel anyway, a lot of the time when I invoke or stoke up these feelings. So yeah, it's worth bearing this in mind when we make the claim that paranoia is simply useful to the artist. Most artistic paranoia, I think, is staged, stoked up by an ironic artistic intelligence. Now, all this is by way of leading me on to my own sort of academic area of expertise, which, as Pierre mentioned, is Latin American literature, and specifically the works of a writer called, I hope some of you maybe have read, called Jorge Luis Borges, an Argentine writer. Borges, he was born in 1899 in Argentina, and he's generally, when it comes to sort of periodization questions, he's generally placed on the downslope of literary modernism. He's often grouped alongside, as it hurtles into postmodernism or whatever the hell comes after it. He's often grouped with people like Kafka, Beckett, that kind of grouping, if that means anything to people. But what makes him interesting, I think, for our purposes and for the purposes of today, is that Borges is one of the first modernist writers who makes conspiracy and paranoia not just a sort of an affective feature of his writing, but actually makes it a subject and a theme of his writing. A lot of the contents, a lot of the stories that Borges writes in the 40s and 50s are about conspiracy theories and hoaxes. And I think this is particularly interesting because it allows him to modulate what I've already said and put to you is a necessary irony in literary paranoia. It allows him to modulate this in all kinds of new ways. So I think the story I'd like to look at today in particular, rather than going through his entire oeuvre because it's vast, is a 1940s story. It's called Tlön Ukbar Orbis Tertius. Tlön Ukbar Orbis Tertius. And it's one of his first, I think, truly great stories. In a lot of ways, it's classic Borges. It's a sort of literary detective romp where Borges, a sort of fictionalized Borges, and a fictionalized version of his friend Adolfo Bioy Casares, they happen upon a mysterious book, and this book tells of a lost civilization named Tlön. And there's a lot of sort of pseudo-anthropological stuff about the Tlönians, the people who inhabit this mythical planet or country or whatever it turns out to be. The Tlönians in the story are congenitally idealist, that's a quote. They admit no causality, they don't really believe in matter or any kind of mind-independent reality at all. And I've included actually somewhere on this sheet, I believe it's just at the bottom of the first page, number 5. I've included a wonderful passage where Borges describes how the metaphysical conclusions that a lot of us hold as our kind of spontaneous common sense view of the world are to the Tlönians, heretical, conspiratorial, crank-like, and paranoiac. So I think the time's I need another reader.
Amongst the doctrines of Tlön, none has merited the scandalous reception accorded to materialism. Some thinkers have formulated it with less clarity than fervor, as one might put forth a paradox. In order to facilitate the comprehension of this inconceivable thesis, a heresiarch of the 11th century devised the sophism of the 9 copper coins, whose scandalous renown is in Tlön equivalent to that of the Eleatic paradoxes. There are many versions of this species reasoning, which vary the number of coins and the number of discoveries. The following is the most common. On Tuesday, X crosses a deserted road and loses 9 copper coins. On Thursday, Y finds in the road 4 coins, somewhat rusted by Wednesday's rain. On Friday, Z discovers 3 coins in the road. On Friday morning, X finds 2 coins in the corridor of his house. The heresiarch would deduce from this story the reality, i.e. the continuity, of the 9 coins which were recovered. It is absurd, he affirmed, to imagine that 4 coins have not existed between Tuesday and Thursday, 3 between Tuesday and Friday afternoon, 2 between Tuesday and Friday morning. It is logical to think that they have existed at least in some secret way, hidden from the comprehension of men, at every moment of those 3 periods.
Thank you very much. It's a short quotation. It's very hard to cut down Borges into. Sorry, it's a long quotation. I meant to say. It's very, very hard to cut down Borges into anything shorter. So thank you for bearing with it. I think why this is so important to me, I think, in the history of modernism, is that this is a clear literalization of the point I was making, and that these historians Sass and Trotter are making about metaphysics being a kind of paranoiac or conspiratorial mode. We can imagine, can't we, to the Tlönians, there's some nutter who turns up and says, look, I've got this crazy idea, but I think that which is immediately self-evident to us, our immediate sense perceptions, I have this feeling that there's this further, deeper reality that's hidden to us. And I believe that every object actually exists even when we don't look at it. And what's happening here, I think, is that reason, the application of reason, the following of a chain of reasoning sort of past that which is immediately self-evident is a kind of paranoia. I'm going to cut this down a little bit because this could go on too long. I'll leave it there, just with this association of metaphysics and paranoia, and then if people are interested in this, we can talk about it more in the Q&A. So I think the question still remains, to some extent, what's the use of staging paranoia in art like this? If we've said, haven't we, that there's something about the age these people are writing from that is already paranoiac. What is it that separates artistic paranoia, as staged, if you like, by an Eliot or a Borges, from any other paranoiac utterance? And here I think this is where I'd like to make my little my contribution, if you like, the literature, or indulge my own sort of coinage. I think we need to note an important difference between the paranoia that we get in sort of official discourses that within a paranoiac culture, and artistic paranoia. Excuse me, sorry, frog in my throat. In official discourses of a paranoiac culture, unified coherent meanings are pursued and then they are attained. You follow a chain of signification and then you reach its end. A poem, an image, a flag, everything just sort of does what it says on the tin. There's a sort of dream of what I would call positivist signification. During World War I, when Eliot's writing, official discourses were both paranoiac and positivist. So you've got this strange situation where you're flooded with propaganda, and you're encouraged by posters you see in the street to view plots and suspicions, to see plots and suspicion everywhere. But simultaneously, you're not encouraged to get creative with this. I have included somewhere on the handout a few examples of wartime propaganda. I'm very interested actually in the second one. If you look, there's this sort of simian creature who's kidnapped a woman and has a club. I like this because it demonstrates a very common feature of this sort of wartime propaganda, which is that it's pointlessly labeled. If you look at the monkey creature, it's carrying a club, and the club says Kultur. In other words, I find this, why bother with that? I think the metaphor does well on its own. But there's this urge, I think, among propagandists to make every constituent part of a piece of wartime propaganda check out and be schematized. And there's a mania for labeling that goes on here. Again, I think we can discern the same kind of paranoiac impulse towards schematization here. But crucially, this sort of positivist paranoia wants the buck to stop somewhere. Okay, it wants the buck, in this case, to stop at Germans. Interestingly, when Borges is writing during the Second World War, and he's writing from Argentina, where his immediate higher up at the National Library of Argentina is a really quite nasty little man called Hugo Vast, who, among many other distinctions, was the great popularizer of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in Argentina. So Borges is inhabiting a very conspiratorial milieu. But rather than these vast, open-ended Baroque conspiracy theories that the Tollernians come up with, he's encountering a very rigid and narrow form of conspiracy theorizing, where the chain of signification always ends, and it always ends at the Jews. Now, I would like to put it to you that this binary or dichotomy that I've sketched, I think this still is valid in our own time. As I see it, the current paranoiac mode of discourse, if you like, is really a tussle between two distinct sensibilities. One is a kind of ironic paranoiac mode, if that makes sense, if that isn't an oxymoron, although, arguably it is. An ironic paranoiac mode where, like in Eliot, like in Borges, the impetus of paranoia is harnessed for creative ends and balanced with an ironic sensibility that knows that reality is inexhaustible. And I would count among the practitioners of this mode, real cranks and weirdos and conspiracy theorists who believe the sun is a giant LED, or that all of history is a fabrication by Jesuits. There's a beautifully open-ended baroque and something that we can, I think we can all learn from if we're trying to be writers or artists or just engage with art and literature. At the same time, I think this positivist paranoia also is still around today. And it's characterized, I think, less by a frantic yearning for systematicity, for everything checking out, than by a rigid adherence to systematicity, a real steadfast belief in systematicity. It's kind of everywhere these days. Actually, interestingly, I think this is the dominant mode of a lot of sort of official fact-checking type discourses. Harvard equals good institution equals truth. But it's also, in an almost perfectly symmetrical way, I think, an increasingly popular mode among these sort of self-professedly heterodox. Harvard equals woke institution equals untruth. I think this is equally paranoiac and equally closed. And I think one of the saddest consequences of this, for me at least, who's someone who sort of is aesthetically minded in some sense, is that our conspiracy theories have got drabber and more boring. Now you've just got the blob or the establishment or the, they, just a pronoun, where once you had lizard people, you had, really interesting stuff. So I'll leave you with this. I would never want to tame paranoia completely as an impulse or as a hermeneutic strategy, if you'll allow me to say it grandiosely, or to temper our conspiracy theorizing impulses even, which I think can be extremely fruitful. But I would also plead with you to be responsible paranoiacs in some sense, and just remain open to the sheer strangeness of what the world might whisper in your ear if you let it. Thank you.
This episode was mixed by Daniel Neal. Thanks for listening and join us next time.